listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production. Welcome to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders Uncommon Masonic Education presentation. I'm John Nagy, and I'll be your coach, host, presenter this evening. This material, this workshop has been shared in various forms and shapes over the last maybe 10 or 11 years, all around not only the nation, but the world. The presentation represents about maybe 35 to 40 minutes of information that is typically presented within a 6.5 hour time frame, workshops that I do in person and on Zoom. And it is designed to convey light to the front end workers, the mentors, the coaches, the trainers, and the instructors to help them coach and assist this next generation toward betterment. It's based on the materials that I have done research on. I've published maybe 15 or 16 different books along the lines of what you're going to be hearing tonight. And this specific information comes from somewhat in Building Boaz, because I went ahead and produced Building Boaz many, many years ago. This specific information is kind of touched upon, but not going into it, the detail that you'll be hearing tonight. I'm going to give you a heads up. At the end of the presentation, when I'm closing it down, I'm going to be asking you, what did you get out of the presentation? What's your takeaway? And of course, any kind of future changes that you anticipate based on the value that you've received, along with kind of impacts that you might see on your progress, or perhaps how you might be coaching, instructing, and mentoring the next generation. This is what you want to say to a candidate when they ask you about that shoe removal. Now, interestingly enough, there was a brother who PM'd me back channel about 2 or 3 days ago, maybe 4 or 5, and said, I asked him, what would you like me to talk about? And he said, well, I'd like to hear about Boaz. Well, tonight's about Boaz, but I've labeled it about that shoe removal. The word candidate is derived from a Latin phrase that basically means clothed in white. Toga candida is a form of a white robe. And if you were running for office or you were a candidate for something, you would be dressed in a white robe. The reason for the white robe is because you're neither naked nor clad. You're kind of somewhere in between. And of course, the white represents innocence. You hadn't been told that you were entering upon sacred holy land. This is a symbolic representation of King Solomon's temple. It was built on the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite, and that was on top of Mount Moriah. It was considered sacred land. And if you went into King Solomon's temple, particularly the Holy of Holies, you were expected to take your shoes off. And there are echoes of it in the Bible about taking shoes off on holy land. You've got Exodus 3:5, where it says, the Lord said to Moses, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And it's also echoed in Joshua 5:15, where the commander of the Lord's army replied to Joshua, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy, which basically tells you it could be anywhere that you're asked to take your shoes off. If the Lord says it's holy, you better take your shoes off. Now you took well, by the way, this is called the rite of discalciation. And it comes from the Latin means to be unshod, which means that both of your feet are without shoes. It's not unique to any kind of Jewish faith. It is something that Pythagoras did in ancient Greece with his followers when they went into the temple. And it is a custom found in Islam, some Oriental nations and or religions, along with Ethiopia, ancient Peru, and of course, the Druids in England. These are the practices of all of these. But you were neither barefoot nor shod, which tells you that you always had one shoe on, or you had one foot covered and the other one was not covered, which means that this is not the rite of discalciation. It's something else. You were neither barefoot nor shod, and this is agreeable to the Israeli custom that was adopted by the Freemasons when it started, way back when. And when we read in the book of Ruth what it actually said about the removal of one shoe, not both, but one shoe, it says, now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing. For to confirm all things, a man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor. And this was a testimony in Israel. This was Ruth 4:7, King James Version. It is further said in our Freemasonic lore, in our ritual, that this therefore we do, testifying thereby to the strongest manner possible to our sincerity. But this is not the whole story. And as Paul Harvey would say, here comes the rest of the story. I want to focus on that phrase, concerning redeeming and concerning changing, to confirm all things. And we're going to start in with the book of Ruth. Ruth was the grandmother of King David. She gave birth to a son who gave birth to another son, finally brought around to King David. And she was known for her kindness and faithfulness. Now, the actual word Ruth means compassion for the misery of another. And this comes into play in the story, because what Ruth does is basically act out her name. She was not an Israelite herself. She was a Moabite. She was from Moab, and she married into an Israelite family. The person that she married was a brother that came to the country with his family. So there was the father and the two boys, probably had the mother come along with them, and we'll find out that name right now. However, the mother will be named later. Sorry, this is first time through, I'm getting it. Ruth's husband dies somewhere along this story. And what happens is Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, they set out to return to the country of the Israelites. So they're going to cross around the Dead Sea and go back to the Israelite area. This is because Naomi was also a widow. And as a result of being a widow, she had an inheritance that she had to sell, which was the land back in Israel. So what happens is we find out Ruth is a widow. Ruth had no male heir whatsoever. So she was basically Naomi's property, because as the customs are at that time, if you have a widow who's a mother-in-law and you're the daughter-in-law and you don't have a husband, you're now property of her inheritance. So being Naomi's property, what happens is Naomi immediately recognizes there's no reason to drag her back to Israel. Why don't you just stay here in Moab and go back to your family? And of course, what happened, Ruth said she'll have none of that. And this is the phrase that you'll hear often at weddings. She says to Naomi, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. So effectively, she would say, yeah, you can send me away, but I ain't going. So we find out Naomi is a widow, that she had two daughter-in-laws, both Ruth and Orpah. Both daughters-in-law were widows, so all three women were widows. And Naomi had rights to all the property that her dead husband and her sons had. She was the inheritor. And both daughters-in-law were her responsibility because they were the property, they were chattel. That's how it worked. So Naomi basically wanted to go back to Israel to sell her property. But she was obligated to offer the property first to the next in line, because now that the husband was dead and the sons were dead, she had to go to the next closest relative. And that next closest relative was called a guardian redeemer. Now, guardian redeemers this was a pretty cool tradition set up within a community, because they had to be a close, influential relative, and they were part of an extended family, and the family would turn to them specifically under these two conditions: when a family line or possessions were in danger of being lost. That's really interesting. Both the family line and possessions. Well, the family line was dead. There was no husband on any one of these three. So there was no offspring. So Naomi was faced with a situation. She had a debt to pay to her family to make sure that the possessions and the line continued within the family. They were not lost. So she went back to Israel. She needed a guardian redeemer to purchase her property. And the question is why? To keep the property in the family. And you're probably asking yourself, well, how do you sell property to keep it in the family? How does that work? Well, the guardian redeemer had to basically produce a grandson for her through either Ruth or Orpah. So she was trying to set it up so one of the guardian redeemers would redeem the property, produce an heir, so the property could be inherited by the widow's son. And this was their tradition. So they went from Moab to Bethlehem, and they came across a property of a pretty well-off individual by the name of Boaz, which they find out is another guardian redeemer. But he's not next in line. So what happens is they start basically hanging around Boaz's property, and it was the custom at that time that if you were not well off, you were able to go into a field after they harvested and pluck up the seed so that you could be fed. And Boaz basically saw what was going on, and basically he said to everybody, don't mess with Naomi and Ruth. Let them glean all they can. In fact, while you're reaping, make sure that you leave enough behind so that they have something worth picking. So right from the start, he started taking care of them. In fact, not only was he taking care of them, but he invited Ruth to sit down and break bread with him at various times while she was around. Well, Naomi saw what was going on and basically said, Ruth, pursue Boaz. And with the instructions from Naomi, Ruth basically showed up one evening after Boaz had been working in the field diligently, and he was well fed and let's just say he had his food and he had his beverage. And he had bedded down on the threshing floor, threw open his cloak, put it down over his body, and she showed up and she removed the cloak from his feet. Now, I'm sure that this is some sort of euphemism or idiom of the time, because the next morning when he looked down and saw Ruth by his feet, and his feet were showing, he automatically started thinking, I've got to do the right thing here, so I'm going to have to marry her. So what happens is he wakes up, sees Ruth, basically says, okay, I know what I need to do. So what happens is, he really did want to marry her by now. And problem is, Ruth was Naomi's property. But Boaz was a guardian redeemer, but he was not the next one in line to be doing any of the redeeming. So he started plotting and scheming, and he arrived at a decision. So what he did was he gathered 10 elders at the gates of the city. And as the next in line approached, he basically turned him around, told him to sit down, and he said, "You're the next in line. Naomi wants to sell her property. You're the next in line. What are your intentions? Speak up now." And so the guardian redeemer said, "Well, she wants to sell her property. I'll buy it." Well, the next thing you know, Boaz says, "Oh, and by the way, Ruth is part of that property." Well, immediately this guy says to himself, "Oh, no. I can't accept Ruth as my responsibility. My inheritance would be jeopardized if I took her on board. So you go, I do not want to purchase the property. You purchase it for yourself." And he takes his shoe off and hands it to Boaz at that instant, basically confirming the deal. Now, let me give you some clarity on this. If a brother-in-law is involved, so I've got my brother, he dies. The widow's right next to him. It's my responsibility to make sure my brother's name continues if he does not have a son. So I would take the widow, I would marry her, and I would basically try to produce a male heir for my brother and in his name, to keep that property in the family and make sure the property and the family name continues. Now, if the brother basically says, "Nope, don't want to do it," immediately that widow has the right to come over, grab my leg, take off the shoe, and spit before me. And in some versions, spit at my face, and then say, "I'm now labeled as the brother who would not fulfill his obligation to his brother." And that would make her a free agent to allow her to openly remarry in the hope of providing a son to continue the family line and the ownership of her dead husband's property. Are you seeing the connection between the Ruth situation and that? I hope you are. However, this was not what was called a Levirate marriage. Lever means brother, and a Levirate marriage was where a brother would marry the widow. In a Levirate marriage situation, only a brother is obligated in order for that marriage to be sanctified in that and honored in that tradition. So back to the Boaz situation. When that shoe was handed over to Boaz, Boaz now the next in line to accept and purchase the property from Naomi. And in the book of Ruth, both Boaz eventually did become the guardian redeemer for Naomi. And as a result of that redemption of the property to keep the family property and the family name going, he went ahead and brought Ruth into that. Ruth would have a son in order for all that to occur. So the son, when Boaz died, would inherit Naomi's property. And that's how all that tradition worked. The word Boaz means swiftness or strength. And if you look at the etymology of it, it refers to in the strength of, in him is strength, and also to be strong. And we have this as one of the pillars in the porch of King Solomon's temple. You know which one is left or right, because that's part of your catechism. And there is one scholar who actually says that he prefers this following meaning, of sharp mind. Well, I can tell you, the character of Boaz was swift, was strong, as in he had the resources, and he was definitely cunning. He knew exactly what he needed to do to bring about what he wanted. I'm now going to go a little bit into Freemasonry. Virtue literally is strength. And when you build virtue, you build manly strength or you build Boaz. How do you do that? Well, we've got 7 virtues in the entered apprentice degree that are pointed toward. They are the cardinal and the theological virtues. We've reviewed this many times, and you're hearing it one more time. This is a wonderful way of doing a mnemonic, a memory device. You take the 4 and the 3, you make a cube and a triangle, and what you do is you put them together, and what you have is the apprentice's apron as it's supposed to be worn during your entered apprenticing. What you are building, however, is a house of virtue. And in that house of virtue, you are creating a foundation of strength or a foundation of Boaz. If you take a look at the square of virtue, which is the square of strength, your common gavel is how you create that square of virtue. By taking the common gavel and guiding it with virtue, you are going to divest yourself, winnow away the vices and superfluities. And you start squaring your actions by the square that you build, by the chipping away of those vices and superfluities. The common gavel actually symbolizes the investiture of virtues or the building of strength within. The foundation is of strength or Boaz, and it is your first step in the process of becoming a full-fledged member. Now comes the review. Naomi needed to sell her property to keep it in the family. And in order to do that, she had to get somebody to commit to giving her a grandson. So by purchasing the property, you basically are committing to creating a grandson to inherit the property. And this, of course, required a guardian redeemer. Because Orpah was no longer in the area, Ruth became the one that had to produce the kid. And if you purchase the property, you're also basically purchasing the right to sire a son. And the next of line didn't want to do any of that because of his own inheritance being put into jeopardy. So what happens is the next in line wound up becoming Boaz, and the original guardian redeemer relinquished his claim to the property and the rights to the first purchase over to Boaz. Boaz went ahead and accepted this, and that paved the way to his marriage to Ruth, and eventually with the marriage came the widow's son. An operative candidate. They were just hitting puberty. They were just about sprouting their first hairs. And that's when they entered into apprenticeship. They were underage, they were bound, and they were unable to give consent. Their guardian redeemers are the ones that basically said, you will accept apprenticeship over here, and that'll be 7 years of indentured servitude under this master. You were effectively chattel. And being chattel, you were property, and you didn't have a choice. You had to do what it is that you were told to do. And being told what to do, they were indentured for that 7 years under that master, working off their debt of being taught a trade for 7 years. And they came up to speed very quick, and they started growing muscles left and right, and they grew into manhood. And by the time they were men, they worked off their indentured 7 years, and they became free agents. Speculative candidates, a whole different story. They're free agents to begin with. They're of legal age, they're not bound, and they're able to give full consent of their own free will and accord. They are their own men. And what they do when they come in is they commit to further progress until it is completed in full. Now let's go ahead and look at the candidate relevance here. When a candidate comes in, before they enter through that door, they take off their shoe, and it's a symbolic gesture to relinquish their claim and their right. Just as the guardian redeemer did to Boaz, where he relinquished his right to the property, the candidate relinquishes his right and claim to his old ways and his whole old life. And this is by choice. He must choose to relinquish this claim, and who he relinquishes the claim to are the brothers in his charge, that he is I know I've had this worded right. They are charged with receiving that shoe, because in order for him to continue, he has to relinquish his claim, his right to his old ways. He's starting a new life. These brothers have now been authorized to go about making a widow's son. Just like the guardian redeemer in Ruth's situation relinquished his right to Boaz, the moment that Boaz had that shoe is the moment that Boaz had the right to start the process of basically making way for Ruth's son, the widow's son. The candidate, by relinquishing his right and his claim, is actually redeemed by his future actions within the craft, buying his freedom from apprenticeship, and thus starting the process of becoming a widow's son himself. And once he becomes a widow's son, he is then a full-fledged member of the craft, which is a few steps down the line. Background, widow's son. Who else was a widow's son? Well, King Solomon, the builder of King Solomon's temple. King Solomon became a widow's son when his father David died and handed over the kingdom, and the moment that death occurred, he started building that temple. It took him 7 years to complete. The widow's son is an interesting term. Widow literally has the roots in separation. If you look up the etymology of the word widow, it means the separated. And when you said somebody was widowed, you were basically saying they were separated from their husband. And at the time, it didn't mean that the husband was dead. It just means that she was no longer with, she was separated from. And it has since morphed to a death situation. And there is a winnowing process. In any separation, you are winnowing, you're separating. And this is an agricultural term that is used on a threshing floor, which, by the way, is right before you. Ornan's threshing floor is what King Solomon's temple was built upon. And you, as an entered apprentice, will go through several stages in your working your way to becoming a full-fledged widow's son. You separate yourself from the profane world, and you enter in upon the temple. That's your first stage. It is a separation. You are winnowing away the profane world. If you do the entered apprentice work, you will winnow away your vices and superfluities, and you will gain strength by doing so. As you continue taking steps, you will widow away from the unknowing of the world, because you will be getting more and more light as you progress. And as you get more light, you're going to become more knowing, and you will separate yourself from those who do not know. And of course, you're also going to go through a stage where you're no longer going to avoid things. In fact, you're going to be a person who completes things, gives their words, and follow through on their words. And you're going to recognize people who avoid being true to their word, individuals who don't complete things. And these are a series of borns that you will go through. When I say born, understand it's not just a boundary that you're going through. This is a phase where you transition from one state of being to another. And the state transition is irreversible. Once you go through that born, you cannot go back. The widow's son term refers to separation and offspring. And when you put the entire process together that you are going through as an apprentice all the way through to Master Mason, it is you that you are producing an offspring of a continuous separation process from the profane, from the vices or superfluities, from the unknowing, and finally from the avoiders. You are the outcome or the offspring of multiple stages of separation or widowing. And as a result of this widowing, you become the offspring of the widowing process or the widow's son. The points that I want you to take away from this are as follows. Yes, you're on sacred ground, but you're not fully grounded. You don't have both feet firmly on the ground yet. You'll get there in time. You are a guardian redeemer, but you must relinquish your right to certain aspects of your life as you come through that door. And you must also be redeemed. So you are both the redeemer and the redeemed through your own efforts. You must engage in widowing as you progress through the stages of Masonry. And as you work toward becoming the widow's son, you will transform irreversibly. And last but not least, in doing your entered apprentice work, you are laying the foundation of King Solomon's temple, a body of wisdom that only you can give yourself. No one else can do it for you. This is what you want to say to candidates when they ask about that shoe removal. As I had indicated before, I'm going to ask you what your takeaways are, any future changes that you might see happening as a result of the light that you were provided here today, and last but not least, any impact that you anticipate as a result. I'll also take any questions and any thoughts that you might want to share. Let me go ahead and wrap this up, and then we'll get into the Q&A. The information that you received tonight is out of Building Boaz. The Building series is where I do my research and provide the light. And you've been listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders Uncommon Masonic Education presentation. I thank you very much. You can find me on Facebook, MeWe, Codius, and Coach.net, along with my blog, buildinghiram.blogspot.com, and my YouTube channel, John S. Nagy. Brothers, thank you so much. So let's go ahead and get into... Thank you. You've been listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.